Tonight, I will be speaking on John chapter 2, verse 18 through 22. So the Jews said to him, "What sign do you show us for doing these things?" Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." The Jews then said, "It has been 46 years to build this temple, and will you raise it up in 3 days?" But he was speaking about the temple of his body. When therefore he was raised from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this, and they believed the scripture and the word Jesus had spoken. When Jesus came to the temple of the Jews, he had thrown out the money changers. The Jews did not like him telling them what to do, so they said, "Give us a sign to show us your authority." Jesus heard this and said to them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will restore it." Now there is a big misunderstanding here. The Jews thought he was talking about the physical temple, but Jesus was talking about his body being the temple. Jesus did not give them a sign because he did not need to. The Jews would then later see that Jesus was predicting his own death and resurrection, and that would then be their sign of his authority. What point does Jesus want to make about the temple? To first answer this question, we must understand what the temple was and how important it was to the Jews. The temple was where God lived. The temple contained the Ark of the Covenant, and this is where atonement was made for the people. The way they would have their sins forgiven was by having a priest go to the Ark of the Covenant and sprinkle blood on the mercy seat. We can see that when Jesus said to destroy it, why the Jews would have been mad. When Jesus called himself the temple, he wanted to transfer the image of the physical temple to an image of himself. This was Jesus' way of saying, if you want to be close to God, you must go through me. In John 14:6, it says, Jesus said to him, "I am the way and the truth and the life. No one comes into the Father except through me." Even in prayer, we say Jesus' name, amen. God is too holy for our sinful selves. Jesus is not just cleansing the temple, but he is replacing the temple with his body and fulfilling his purpose. The Jews were making sacrifices, but Jesus made the ultimate and final sacrifice. The point Jesus wanted to make about the temple is that they no longer need the temple. They need Jesus instead. In conclusion, here are 3 takeaways. The Jews wanted a sign over his authority to cleanse the temple. The sign is Jesus' resurrection. The book of John is meant to show people that Jesus is the Son of God, and this passage is evidence of that. Finally, Jesus is the place of worship, atonement, and the place of forgiveness. The temple is no longer these things. Thank you for your kind attention. I'll also be doing the reading. The reading is Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 through 5, and it says, "Now the point in what we are saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. For every high priest is appointed to offer gifts and sacrifices. Thus it is necessary for this priest also to have something to offer. Now if he were on earth, he would not be a priest at all, since there are priests who offer gifts according to the law. They serve a copy and shadow of heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, 'See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown to you on the mountain.'" This is the word of the Lord.
Good evening, everyone. It is a blessing to be with you this evening. We will do our best to get out of here before any storms even come close to us. That's Oklahoma for you, right? Always dodging those storms. Tonight, we're going to be continuing our Exodus study. We are in the section that deals with the tabernacle and all the instructions given there and the instructions for worship that accompany that. This is part of the information given to Moses on the mountain. Now, all along through this Exodus study, guys that have been given a section to talk about, usually it's, a chapter, a bunch of verses, an event. I get 2 verses. So let's see what we can make out of 2 verses. I guess I better turn this on. So tonight we're going to talk about concerning the pattern. Oh, there it goes. Exodus 25, verses 8 and 9. God is giving these instructions for building this tabernacle, and he is specifically at this moment giving instructions to have certain people bring in various supplies and materials, and God says this to Moses, "And let them make me a sanctuary, that I may dwell in their midst, exactly as I show you concerning the pattern of the tabernacle, and all of its furniture, so you shall make it." So there's our 2 verses. I guess we can go now. The New Testament is going to pick up this and is actually going to blow this wide open. So we do have a few things we need to talk about before we get out of here this evening. The first question I want to ask about this, because we have chapters worth of instructions for the tabernacle, and then we have the stern warning that the New Testament picks up about following this pattern, following these instructions exactly. And so I want us to think for a moment, why does God give them all of these instructions and demand such exacting obedience to those instructions? Now, if we're not careful, we can answer this question in an incorrect way. And sometimes we do, and I've been guilty of this. Is God arbitrary? Is he giving arbitrary instructions as maybe a test? Like just coming up with some random things, and I'm just going to make sure these guys just know how to obey. So here's the list of exactly what to do. He's just coming up with random things to see if they obey. Is God looking for excuses for smiting? Especially in the Old Testament, sometimes we think about God as if he's just there with the bolt of lightning in his hand, just waiting for somebody to mess up so he can strike him down. And if we're not careful, talking about these exact specifications and the strict obedience to them, we can paint a picture of God as if he is coming up with arbitrary rules and just waiting for an excuse to strike his people down. So let's look at what the New Testament has to say about this and find the answers to these questions here. Hebrews chapter 8, verses 5 and 6 picks these up. These were in Silas's reading, talking about the priest and the duties that they would serve in the tabernacle or in the temple, as it later became. Saying this about the priest: they serve a copy and a shadow of the heavenly things. For when Moses was about to erect the tent, he was instructed by God, saying, "See that you make everything according to the pattern that was shown you on the mountain. But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises." So the writer of Hebrews here is referring back to our verse from Exodus 25 about this specific command that God has given to Moses to follow these instructions exactly. And so we're going to break this down into 2 sections. First, the first section where it says they serve a copy and shadow of the heavenly things. What are we talking about here? How are these instructions a copy and a shadow of heavenly things? And then we're going to talk about what that has to do with this more excellent ministry that Christ has obtained. First of all, how is this tabernacle a shadow of heavenly things? If you were to come up with an image in your mind of heavenly things, we might think of these angels, these glowing things, stars in the sky, some ethereal light coming from somewhere. And yet to them, this was the shadow, the copy and shadow of heavenly things. I've discussed before in previous sermons regarding patterns that originate from Eden. There are a lot of patterns that come through within this tabernacle. We'll go through these. We won't spend near as long as we did on them in those previous sermons. And so if you want more details on some of these things, you can go back and reference those sermons from our Eden to Eternity series that should still be online. The tabernacle bore quite a few similarities to the Garden of Eden. First of all, God's presence was there. In Genesis chapter 3, verse 8, it talks about God walking with them in the cool of the day. Exodus 25, verse 8, in our reading this evening, God wants this sanctuary built that I may dwell in their midst. You see, we talked before with the golden calf how the people had demonstrated very clearly how sinful they still are. And how on earth is a holy and righteous God supposed to be in the midst of this sinful people? He's setting up a safe space. Not safe for him, but safe for the sinful people who would be in his righteous presence. Be a protection for them. So we see, similar to the Garden of Eden, God's presence is there. There's guarding cherubim in Genesis 3:24. When Adam and Eve are sent from the garden, cherubim are placed over the entrance to that garden, and talks about them having a flaming sword. Exodus 25, verse 18, talks about this holy of holies that's in the tabernacle. And you shall make 2 cherubim of gold. There were illustrations of different types of angels all through this tabernacle, and specifically these 2 cherubim of gold that are sitting across the mercy seat. There's a holy tree in the tabernacle. In Genesis 2 and 9, we see in the Garden of Eden that there's a tree of the knowledge of good and evil. And also we read about in the Garden of Eden, the tree of life is also there. Exodus 25, verse 31, you shall make a lampstand of pure gold. And this lampstand was very reminiscent of, here's one of our holy trees. This lampstand was supposed to be very reminiscent of a tree. It even had buds and leaves all through its branches. I believe Mike will be giving us a talk sometime in the future that goes into far more detail about this lampstand. But we see this as a representation of something that was there in Eden, a similarity to the Garden of Eden. We see that there were precious stones there. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 12, we get this whole list of all these precious stones that littered the Garden of Eden. It was a very shiny, a very bright place. There was gold there. There are all these precious stones. Exodus 25 and verse 7, talking about what the people were commanded to bring in. They were to bring in onyx stones and stones for settings, for the ephod and for the breastpiece. So this was a metal plate that the high priest was to wear, and it would have these very stones embedded in it. And those all had specific representations. And so, like if you were to observe the Garden of Eden, you would see all these precious stones. If you went into this holy area, into the tabernacle, you would once again see these precious stones. Now, here's a few examples of what some of those may have been like. The tabernacle had an entrance facing the east. Genesis 3, verse 24, we see that the entrance to the garden was on the east side of the garden. In Exodus 27, verse 13, talking about the instructions to build the outer fence of the outer court of the tabernacle, the breadth of the court on the front to the east. So we see that entrance was facing the east. The tabernacle, like the Garden of Eden, was to be a place of wisdom. In Genesis chapter 2, verse 9, the tree of the knowledge of good and evil were there. In Exodus chapter 40, verse 20, he took the testimony and put it into the ark. So this testimony of God's will resided there. The tabernacle was a place of wisdom. This tabernacle was full of image bearers, like the Garden of Eden had image bearers, those who were made in the image of God, placed in it. In Genesis 2:15, talking about Adam and his wife Eve, and they bear the image of God. Exodus chapter 28, verse 36, talking about this was a thing that the priests were supposed to wear on their forehead. You shall make a plate of pure gold and engrave on it, and then skip to the end of the verse, and it would say, holy to the Lord. So those priests in there weren't just dressed in their special garb, but they literally had the name of God on their forehead. They bore the name of God. These are just a few examples of similarities to Eden. If you really dig into the details and the instructions for the tabernacle, there's a lot more there. This is a high level, and we're running from the storm, so we can't spend a whole lot of time on these. In previous talks, we've talked about how the tabernacle is a microcosm. What is a microcosm? That is literally short for microcosmos. The tabernacle was to be constructed in such a way where it represented the three-part structure of reality, where you have the physical earth, the heavens above, and then God on his holy throne in heaven. Here's an example of a microcosm, what I think of as a microcosm. This is a terrarium, and some of these guys, I've seen them do this on YouTube, and it's interesting. And they will make a whole video that's like 28 minutes long of them sticking a piece of carrot in there and watching what all the little creatures do. And the crazier thing than making a 28-minute video about that is the fact that I will sit there and watch it for 28 minutes. Like, what happens to this little carrot? But anyway, so you have this jar, and sealed inside, you've got dirt, you've got plants, all the water it needs, all the air, and it creates its own little cycle. It's like a micro environment, a representation of what nature's like. And the court can stay on these things for forever, and it's a self-sustaining environment inside. It's a small representation of nature, a small representation of reality. So that's what a microcosm is. The tabernacle is a representation of reality. The outer court represents the habitable earth. And so when you were in that habitable or in that outer court, you would see the wash basin, which throughout Scripture is referred to as the sea. There was an earthen altar built out of dirt and soil, and then other things on top of that. This represented land. Bulls and lions, statues of these creatures around represented animals. There were to be decorations of gourds and flowers and pomegranates and all of these things representing plant life. And this was an area that all Israelites could enter. This is where they would go to make their sacrifices, to inquire of the priests. As you go further in, less and less people can enter certain places. So this outer court, all Israelites could enter there. Once you get into the sanctuary, only the priests could go in there. So we have a representation of the physical earth, the habitable earth. The sanctuary inside of that is a representation of the visible heavens. And we have a few examples of some of those things. The lampstand sometimes has been said that it symbolizes the sources of light in the sky. Now, to an early Jewish person, there was the sun and the moon, and then there were 5 visible planets to them that they knew about. And so we have 7 lights on the lampstand in there, on our holy tree in the sanctuary. The curtains were commanded to be put into these sky colors, purples and dark blues and maroon. Exodus 26, that's up there. And the priestly clothing itself were some of these same colors, to be these blues that were representative of the sky. Later on, when this tabernacle was made into a permanent structure known as the temple, Josephus wrote about it. He talked about this inner sanctuary was portrayed a panorama of the heavens. It was meant so that when you walked into that, or when a priest walked into that sanctuary, he was to be immediately struck with an idea of this. It was to be this idea in his mind. In fact, Psalm chapter 78, verses 69 reiterates this idea. He built his sanctuary like the high heavens, like the earth which he has founded forever. So we see that inner sanctuary was to be that next level of creation, of reality, like the high heavens. Our third part of this was the Holy of Holies, that final inner room where the Ark of the Covenant was and where the cherubim were, and this is where God's presence was. This is a representation of God's throne room in heaven. Isaiah chapter 6, verses 1 through 5, I believe, gives us a really good idea of this. This is a vision that Isaiah is given. In the year that King Uzziah died, I saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and the train of his robe filled the temple. Above him stood the seraphim. Each had 6 wings. With 2 he covered his face, and with 2 he covered his feet, and with 2 he flew. And one called to another and said, Holy, holy, holy is the Lord of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. And the foundations of the threshold shook at the voice of him who called, and the house was filled with smoke. And I said, Woe is me, for I am lost, for I am a man of unclean lips, and I dwell in the midst of a people of unclean lips, for my eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. So in this vision, Isaiah sees God sitting upon his throne. And if you notice some of the things we have highlighted, it's very much like, in fact, he even says the train of his robe is filling the temple, as if some of those curtains that were to be in the tabernacle, as if those are the train of God's robe. A bunch of details here translate to details that were in the tabernacle. So that Holy of Holies was to represent God's throne room in heaven. Now that's a spiritual place. You can also read about God's throne room in heaven in a really good passage. We don't have it up here for time's sake, but Revelation chapter 4 even talks about 7 lights being in there. And so hopefully you can see those similarities with the angels being in there, and that seat being in the middle and God's presence being there, filled with smoke. There was to be incense burning in the tabernacle. And so that was also in Isaiah's vision. So a good question to ask, or a good way to think of this, I think, is how do you represent a spiritual place? A place that we can't see, a place that we can't go. How do we represent that in a physical way that somebody could see? And this is how it was to be done. This is how God commanded that to be done, was with this Holy of Holies. And so here's an idea of what something Isaiah may have seen there. And this was to be the type of idea in the mind of those who would see the Holy of Holies, the high priest. This is what that Holy of Holies was kind of there to represent. So talking about the tabernacle being a representation of this, we have this is a prism in the middle. You know, those little glass triangles. And a prism, you shine light in it, and depending on the type of prism, it will break the light apart into rainbow colors, and it will also change the direction of the light. So we have our prism here, and how do we represent what God is actually like? Well, that shines through the prism, and that comes out as the tabernacle. If you wanted to know what God and his relationship to his creation was, the tabernacle was the representation of that. That's why these instructions are so important. The tabernacle was not there to be necessarily a beautiful thing to look at. It wasn't there to necessarily mimic what other religions were doing. It was there to show the people what God and his relationship to his creation was like. So hopefully from this we can see a little bit more to our answer, we can get a little bit closer to our answer to the question. Is God arbitrary? Was he just coming up with a list of his favorite colors for the tabernacle? No, these designs were deeply embedded with many layers of meaning in order to teach truths about God's nature and his relationship to his creation. This tabernacle was a focal point of worship, but it was also a teaching tool for the people. Is God looking for excuses for smiting? You know, an event that always comes to mind was when they're moving the Ark of the Covenant, and Uzzah puts his hand up and he is killed like that. Was God just waiting for him to do something wrong so he could just smite Uzzah? No. The exacting nature of their obedience was meant to protect a sinful people from God's righteousness and glory. And violating that protection resulted in death. The instructions for carrying the ark was for the people carrying the ark for their protection from God's glory, because they were a sinful people. Even the passage that talks about Uzzah putting his hand up, it doesn't say God struck him dead. It says that God broke out, as if his glory could no longer be contained, and that glory overwhelmed and killed Uzzah. And there are other examples like Nadab and Abihu of them being killed by not following this exact pattern that was given, and it's because they violated the holiness of this place. That holiness of this place was there for their protection. And these instructions were given for these two reasons. The deeply embedded layers of meaning that taught what God and his relationship to his people is like, and also to protect them from God's overwhelming righteousness, because they are a sinful people. Even Isaiah, when he's seeing the vision of God on his throne, and he's overwhelmed with his own guilt, and says, "Woe is me, I am a man of unclean lips." Back to our verse in Hebrews. Now, I went through a lot of that real quick. Those are some deep dives, and we hit that on a pretty high level. And I went pretty quick because, well, I've preached on that before, and I know everyone just loves hearing me talk about patterns all the time, right? So now we can slow down just a little bit and try to tease out exactly what the New Testament is trying to make us understand. We understand now what it means that they were serving a copy and shadow of heavenly things. This tabernacle and the things that they were doing were representations of heavenly spiritual things. So we can understand why Moses had to make everything according to that pattern, because it was representing something specific. In verse 6, though, the writer of Hebrews applies this to something else. He says, "But as it is, Christ has obtained a ministry that is as much more excellent than the old, as the covenant he mediates is better, since it is enacted on better promises." So what does all this have to do with Christ and his ministry. If you read the book of Hebrews, you know that the whole book is making the argument that Christ is better than all of these things. And he starts off with talking about how Christ is better than angels. You don't need to worship angels because worshiping Christ is so much better. Christ is so much better than the angels. He talks about the old law. Christ is so much better than that old law. And included within that law are these instructions for the tabernacle and the priestly duties. And his point is that Christ is better than all of these things. We'll see all around this teaching about following this pattern. We see Christ himself as the temple. This is what Silas, he's right there, not over there. This is what Silas talked about. Jesus, basically through his response to the Jews, is declaring that he is the temple. His body will be the temple. And they didn't understand it at the time, but that became clear to the disciples after his resurrection. John 2:19 and skipping to verse 21, Jesus answered them, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." But he was speaking about the temple of his body. So Christ is better because Christ is the temple. The book of Hebrews makes the point that Christ is the priest. Hebrews chapter 8, verses 1 and 2 within our reading. Now the point in what we're saying is this: we have such a high priest, one who is seated at the right hand of the throne of the majesty in heaven, a minister in the holy places, in the true tent that the Lord set up, not man. Now I want to talk about this for a moment, because you've got the priest going into these holy areas, doing these rituals of service, performing these sacrifices, laying their hand on the goat, doing all of these things that they were commanded to do, and doing it just exactly the way that they were commanded to do it. But notice what he says. He says at the end of verse 2, in the true tent that the Lord set up. The true tent. What could be more true than that physical tent there with those actual priests doing those actual things? What on earth could be more true than that? It's the fact that Jesus Christ, after he was resurrected, when he ascended to the Father, he's there in the actual throne room of God, in the actual spiritual place. He's seated there with God, performing those priestly duties. So as we read about the tabernacle and the things that the priests are to do, know that they're not doing the real thing. It's almost like a play pretend. They are showing through the things that they do what Christ will one day do for real. Christ is the true tent. The tabernacle, think of it as the symbol. It's the foreshadowing. It's not the actual. It's not the true. Christ is better because he is literally there in heaven, seated at the right hand of the Father, interceding for us. He's actually there. And the writer of Hebrews says that's the true tent that the Lord set up. Christ himself is the true sacrifice. Hebrews chapter 7, verse 27. Talking about Christ, he has no need, like those high priests, to offer sacrifices daily. First for his own sins and then for those of the people, since he did this once for all when he offered himself up. So those priests are going into the tabernacle and they're making these sacrifices. The Israelites are going in making their sacrifices, and the priests are going into the further layers. And all these sacrifices, all the things we have spelled out for us in the Old Testament, those are all symbolic of the sacrifice that Christ himself would one day make. Those are foreshadowing. Those are predictive. Those are not the real sacrifices. The real sacrifice is Christ and his sacrifice for the sins of mankind once for all on the cross. So as we read all these instructions about the tabernacle in our Exodus study, know that these are symbolic of what Christ would actually really accomplish, that Christ is the real. Everything else was a copy and a shadow meant to lead up to that moment. The writer of Hebrews kind of ties some of these concepts up about Christ in Hebrews chapter 9, verse 11 through 14. But when Christ appeared as a high priest of the good things that have come, then through the greater and more perfect tent, so that the tabernacle of his body, right? That's a greater and more perfect tent than the tabernacle we see in the book of Exodus. Not made with hands, that is, not of this creation. He entered once for all into the holy places, not by means of the blood of goats and calves, but by means of his own blood, thus securing an eternal redemption. For if the blood of goats and bulls and the sprinkling of defiled persons with the ashes of a heifer sanctify for the purification of the flesh, how much more will the blood of Christ, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself without blemish to God, purify our conscience from dead works to serve the living? So the work that Christ performs in his sacrifice and his intercession to God on our behalf, that is the most real thing. That is the most real tabernacle, the most real. Why is that such an important part? You know, these days there's been a lot of talk about, with Israel being in the news, there's always somebody talking about, oh, they're going to rebuild, he's going to come back and rebuild the temple over there. They're going to reinstitute the sacrifices. Why would we want that? That's not what the writer of Hebrews wouldn't think that's a good idea. Why? Those were just symbolic. Those were shadows. Those were copies. Those were predictive in nature, but Christ performed the real work in the sacrifice of himself. Now, were they commanded to sacrifice the blood of goats and bulls? Yes, they needed to follow this pattern because it was predictive. Because it was a teaching tool. So they needed to obey that pattern very specifically, very exactly. So we go back to our diagram. We have God on his throne, and how do we represent that spiritual reality of God reigning over all things from his throne? Well, that image shines through the prism, and if you go back in time, you see the tabernacle. That's how that is represented then. But I think what the author of Hebrews is trying to get us to understand is that the cross, Christ, and the work that he performed is that prism. And so if you look at the tabernacle in detail, what you're going to see are representations all throughout of what Christ would do in the sacrifices, in the way the priest approaches the presence of God. All of these things, they're directly related to what Christ would do. And so it is right for us to go through the tabernacle and not just see, this is like the Garden of Eden. Oh, this is like the throne room of God. But also, this looks like what Christ did. Because Christ is that prism. This is the real thing. From the very beginning, God had the plan for Christ to be on this earth, sacrifice himself, and to be resurrected. It was the plan from the beginning. And so this tabernacle was an early clue that is what would happen. Hebrews chapter 1, verse 3 reiterates this point. And this is the thesis of the book of Hebrews. Speaking of Christ, he is the radiance of the glory of God and the exact imprint of his nature, and he upholds the universe by the word of his power. After making purifications for sin, he sat down at the right hand of the majesty on high. So the actual exact imprint of God's nature, God on his throne, the exact imprint of God's nature, not a shadow or a copy of God's nature, but the exact imprint of God's nature is Christ. Hebrews chapter 8, verses 8 through 13, clues us into another piece of this greater ministry that Christ has. This is shortly after his discussion about Moses following the pattern. For he finds fault with them when he says, "Behold, the days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will establish a new covenant with the house of Israel and with the house of Judah, not like the covenant that I made with their fathers on the day when I took them by the hand to bring them out of Egypt. For they did not continue in my covenant, so I showed them no concern for them, declares the Lord. For this is the covenant that I will make with the house of Israel after those days, declares the Lord." And now he's going to quote from Jeremiah, the book of Jeremiah. "I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts, and I will be their God, and they shall be my people. And they shall not teach each one his neighbor and each one his brother, saying, 'Know the Lord.' For they shall all know me, from the least of them to the greatest. For I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more." In speaking of a new covenant, he makes the first one obsolete, and what is becoming obsolete and growing old is ready to vanish away. So what is he talking about here? There's a very subtle, behind-the-scenes expectation in all the years that the priests would go into that tabernacle and perform their duties and obey the pattern that they were given. There's a very subtle, behind-the-scenes expectation that one day the covenant that they're serving, that is a copy and a shadow of heavenly things, is going to be replaced by the actual thing. And they're looking forward to a time where instead of the testimony being put into the Ark of the Covenant and only the priest can go in there, and only the high priest once a year can even be in the presence of God at all, they're looking forward to a time where instead we have, I will put my laws into their minds and write them on their hearts. I will be their God. That dividing wall between God and man will be completely removed, and mankind will no longer need that protection from God's righteous glory, right? Because mankind himself will be reconciled to God. This is the ministry that Jesus accomplishes. No one's going to have to teach each one his neighbor saying, know the Lord. We're not going to depend on the tabernacle as a teaching device anymore, because now the actual heavenly thing has come and accomplished the purpose. We see the actual. There's no need for that teaching tool anymore. I will be merciful toward their iniquities, and I will remember their sins no more. This is the age of the church, because the church is the body of Christ. And we are those who have put on Christ. He's the one that accomplished the work of salvation, and we put him on, and we are added to his church. And we are in that real tabernacle, in that real tent. So we have our diagram here. We've got God's nature, God upon his spiritual throne, and that reflected into creation, the exact imprint of God's nature is that cross. And if you look backwards in time, you will see that reflected as the tabernacle. If you look forward in time, you see that reflected in the church. Now, I'll be very honest with you for a moment. Up until recent years, I've kind of misunderstood some of this teaching. Because I've looked at the tabernacle and I've said, there's all these similarities with the tabernacle and the church. And I want to go through the tabernacle and say, oh, this is a symbol of this in the church. This is a symbol of that in the church. And what I wind up with is a theology that makes my thinking very church-centric. And what do I mean by that? Your Christianity is based on picking the right church, or the church doing the right thing or the wrong thing. And don't get me wrong, those are extremely important. I'm not trying to diminish that, but to redirect our focus, because the actual is not the church. The actual is Christ. And that's the point that Hebrews makes. That ultimate sacrifice is not done by the church. That ultimate sacrifice was done by Christ himself. The church is not the one in the presence of God interceding on behalf of people, even though we can still do that. It's Christ the one that's actually there in the presence of the Father, interceding for the people. And we can approach the Father through Christ. We don't approach the Father through a church or through a tabernacle. We approach the Father through Christ. And so I think it's important that we make sure we understand that these things are about Christ. And there are a lot of lines you can draw from the tabernacle to the church, and it's right to do that as long as we make sure that the focus is on Christ, not upon us. And there's been times in my life where I've thought very arrogantly, like, oh, wow, those people back in the Old Testament, they didn't know what they were missing out on, and here I am, just so lucky to be in the church. And I place the focus on myself as a church member, and I place the focus on being on the right team or the right group, and I don't place that focus on Christ. So when we read about Moses having to follow that pattern exactly, as the writer of Hebrews talks about, what is our pattern? 1 John chapter 2, verse 6 says it this way: whoever says, I know him, but does not keep his commandments is a liar, and the truth is not in him. But whoever keeps his word, in him truly the love of God is perfected. By this we may know that we are in him. Whoever says he abides in him ought to walk in the same way in which he walked. We talked about how Christ is the actuality, the realest of real of God's nature. The realest of real of those heavenly things. And that is what we are to pattern ourselves after. And how on earth can we claim that we're in him if we don't do what he says, if we don't follow his commandments, if we don't pattern our life after the way he did. And we have a record of how he lived our life, and we ought to be very involved in reading that and studying that and finding out what is the pattern for how I'm to live. That's the point that Scripture's making. That's the point that the writer of Hebrews wants us to understand. That is our pattern that we must follow. I want to end with a few takeaways, and we'll close. We'll go through these very quickly. The tabernacle instructions are there to demonstrate eternal truths about God's nature and his relationship to his creation. As we go through talking about instructions for the tabernacle in the coming weeks, have this in the back of your mind as we go through. How does this show God and his relationship to his creation? Because that's what it's there for. The tabernacle pattern points to the work of Christ by being a shadow of what Christ fulfills. And our pattern is Christ himself. And in the way that the tabernacle would point people forwards to the work of Christ, we as the church are to point people to the work of Christ, which is continually ongoing. This is the thoughts we have for the evening. Hopefully this will guide our study through the rest of this section of Exodus. When we get to these instructions, man, it gets so boring sometimes. This is one of those parts of the Bible that when people are reading through, they tend to zone out on all these instructions. But hopefully this will add some meaning to it. And you can see that these are there for a very good reason, and they served a very good purpose for the people who received those instructions. And like them, there is a lot that we can learn from them. But we need to keep the cross of Christ forefront in our mind as we go through those. If you need the help of the church this evening, we can pray with you and for you. We'll sing our song of invitation and have a seat on the front row if you need help of the church in any way.